I don't think there is actually the need for me to think up a formal introduction given how heavily edited my videos are. So what you are seeing before you right now is the page that I worked on last time when I was sketching. So as you can see, all of the line works have been done. However, there are still more work to do, as you can probably guess. In this case, it's going to be the coloring process. This part is less demanding cognitively. However, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that my commentary would be any better. It would only imply that I will need to try to talk on more tangential topics. Other than that, I guess I will have to go into further detail regarding what I am in fact drawing. So right now what I'm doing is that I am setting up the background for this page. The large areas of dark color you see is supposed to simulate the dark background of space. And there is a rather particular way by which I do this, and I'm trying my best to recreate it from past experience. First of all, I will lower the opacity on this layer. Try and see if any of my previous sketch is making any suggestion as to where I should be putting the star-like object. And I think this is the right location. Now I'm going to trim off the extra portion of the star that isn't needed. There is really no reason, now that I come to think of it, that I shouldn't be doing post-commentary for these videos, but somehow I feel like it's more organic in a way if I am doing live commentary instead. Even though, given the nature of my commentary, it's probably better for the quality and better for my art, to be honest with myself, to do post-commentary. But I will give this format another chance before I decide to do something else instead. This, by the way, if you're looking at the screen, is how I do the glowing effect for my series, using this particular tool and dragging out regions of solid color. There seems to be a problem with that portion there. The original coloring there is too thin. This should make it better. You probably couldn't see what I was doing, but essentially the tool stretches a region of color into an adjacent region. So if the source color is contaminated with a different color that you didn't intend, then it will give this kind of effect here. I will try and see if there is any chance that I would be able to remember and talk about the topics that I have prepared for this video's tangential moments. One of which is the fact that I am trying a new scheme for the way I work on my personal projects. So beside these art videos and obviously the artwork that I'm working on right now I am also doing a bit programming. It might come to you as a surprise that a programmer would also be an artist. But that's how things ended up working out for me, so there is that. I also noticed that with my current drawing tool, there is this strange phenomenon where the color that you pick up using the color eyedropper tool, which allows you theoretically to select a color under your cursor, doesn't actually work the way you expect it to, because sometimes when it picks up a color that when you have put down intended as a pure color, or should I say a color with no saturation to it, when the color eyedropper picks it up, sometimes it adds a certain level of saturation to it that you did not intend. So I'm guessing that this is because the way the data type of color is represented in this system is not by red, blue, and green channel, but rather by hue, value, and saturation channels. And some rounding might be involved when that happens. Also, I just erased my previous work because I wasn't happy with the way it turned out. This seems better. Changed the settings in the blending tool a bit. I remember this part being quite a problem for me when I was trying to optimize it for some other similar tasks. I'm making a mental note that I should remember the related indices for the perfect setting. It seems like when this index is over 50, the tool leaves a trail behind it. Not very much perceivable changes. Okay, I have decided after some testing that I am simply too frustrated to find the exact value to make it work, so I guess I will just try my best to manually recreate the effect that I want, because I don't want to put 20 minutes or so of footage to waste when I edit. You can see why I say that it might be a bit of a sacrifice to the actual quality of my work to be doing recordings of it. Of course, there is also another thing that I can do to save the drawing. That is by turning down the saturation value of the beams of light that I'm drawing right now, and then superimpose another copy of the star so as to make the star seem more opaque than the beams of light. I imagine it would be a lot easier to do this if I am drawing using a sketchpad and a computer, but this is what I have. Anyways, going back to one of the topics that I wanted to talk about, I am doing some other side project beside my artwork and video recording, which is programming. And I found with my habit of programming that what I used to do is that I tend to work in short bursts and then give up for long periods of time. I have been trying a different scheme to work that project, namely, I am trying to spend a short amount of time working on the project each day and trying to avoid burnout by that method. If that works for my programming project, maybe I will try it with other things too. Of course, this may not be of interest to you, but you might just happen to have the same problem with uneven working schedules, so I thought I should let you know. In terms of the artwork itself, I recently read a theory that says there are essentially two ways that the comic media portrays action. One is as a series of active images, so to speak, where the dynamic nature of the image is important. The intent of each panel in that case would be to clearly display the action that is taking place. Coincidentally, and perhaps not very surprisingly, this kind of portrayal of action is also very suitable to adaptation into animation. The other way to portray action in this media is to portray them as still images. The intention behind each individual panel would be to maximize the isolated appeal of each image, rather than as a series of activities. I'm not sure which of these two options would work best for what I have going on here, but I think going with the pictorial rather than active approach, or should I say the pictorial versus the dynamic approach, would be better if my intention were to be a better artist rather than the director of an animation film. Of course, since I learned about this after the sketches for the current pages have already been drawn, it is not possible for me to show that in practice. What you're seeing right now is me coloring the various objects in the page. The way I have chosen to do the color is that to first give every object the color that it should appear in normal lighting, and then overlay shadow or lighting effect over that. I'm not sure if this is the first time I said it, but the way I do my lighting and shadow is similar to a technique known as cell shading, which apparently is a rather difficult skill to master. And I don't think I am anywhere near professional in that respect. However, what I have done so far have been sufficient to please myself. I'm guessing there is still some merit, to say the very least. Even if the fact that I have chosen to use cell shading rather than any other technique is due to the fact that it is the most straightforward method in my given tool. Cell shading also comes with the benefit of saving mental calculation to each shaded detail. So if you're using a more traditional approach of shading, you would have to decide with each shaded object how you want the shadow to look and how the shadow should reflect the texture and shape of the object. Not that cell shading doesn't reflect the shape of the object, but much less so when it comes to the texture. In traditional shading, it's a lot easier to show that some parts of an object is harder by using a stronger contrast between light and shade, so as to suggest angularity, whereas a more gradual gradation of light and dark shows the smooth and softness of a given surface. Maybe the very fact that cell shading allows the artist to avoid making difficult decisions about details such as that is exactly why it is hard to do professionally, because as a professional, the artist would necessarily need to display details such as the softness or the texture of a given object, and by committing to cell shading, the artist essentially sacrifices an important method by which that can be done. I noticed that there is a problem with my line work in that I did not draw the cape in this image. I think that will suffice. If I sound any different, it might be because my realization that much of what I say in videos such as this would be edited so that I feel less pressure to talk perfectly the first time around. This is also why I considered the possibility of doing post-commentary rather than real-time commentary. If my editing didn't show that, I actually took much more than 3 seconds to think up the different types of commentary, to recall their names. The other thing that I wanted to say in this video, as a part of a prepared topic, is the idea of a genre. We hear the word genre all the time in all kinds of different media, but we don't usually think about its precise definition. It may very well be because that the precise definition of a genre is not exactly important. It might also be because that the precise definition of genre is debated. However, here is what I know from my university writing class last year. If that sounds boring to you, well, it might be. However, I wanted to make sure that my expensive tuition didn't go to waste. So here is my best attempt at recalling what I learned. Genre, it said, is the combination of a format and a discourse community. What that means essentially is that genre only exists when there is a body or a population of readers who would pay attention to works in that particular media and genre. By the way, I am fixing some of my line work because when I combined these layers, I didn't realize that there are some overlaps that were not erased. Back to the topic of genre. Take, for example, the horror genre in movies. The genre wouldn't exist if there isn't already a community of people who know about the horror genre. And many conventions of the horror genre, such as jump scares or the order by which a bunch of teenagers in an isolated environment would split up and be killed one after another, are features of the horror movie genre. They are the kind of things audience in that genre would come to expect. Of course, the tropes that I just talked about are often ridiculed because it's so predictable and so arbitrary. However, that is not necessarily the case with other genres. For example, with the anime genre of animation or comics, we come to expect characters to have ridiculously large eyes that would definitely look out of place in a painting, because the genre of painting sets up the expectation for either stylistically unrealistic or somewhat more lifelike portrayals of humanoid characters. Whereas in the anime genre, that is not necessarily the case. Now, when we talk about convention in a media, it is easy for us to think that conventions are oppressive and limiting to creativity. And to an extent, that is true. Because what often happens when someone breaks the rules of genre in a given media is that the reception of that work will be lower than average, to put it mildly. So for example, if you read a comic that is supposed to be in the anime style, except all the characters have realistically sized eyes, you might be intrigued, yes, but at the same time you might find the work to be perfectly distasteful. Now, whether or not you would come to dislike something that breaks the conventions of a genre might be a matter of debate, because some may say that the reason why we don't like something that is outside of the expectation is because the exact expectations are set up by systems that tries to maintain those conventions, as though the genre itself is a sentient being who is opposed to change. It also doesn't help that it creates a kind of antipathy in creators when they feel like they need to appeal to certain features of a genre just to receive attention for their work. Once again, I'm going to take the easy way out and not comment on the moral nature of genre conventions, so I'm not going to make a judgment call to say whether or not having genre conventions is inherently good or bad. What I'm going to say is that, as a matter of fact, works that are outside the generic expectation are often rather obscure, And the reason why we sometimes see great works that seems to be underrated because it defies genre convention is because the genre-breaking works whose qualities are suboptimal simply slip our mind because we never know about them. That's why perhaps we have the impression that whatever breaks the generic rules are supposed to be good. By the way, if you have been looking at the screen, you might see that the way I do my coloring is by first coloring the object that is in the background and then moving on to objects in the foreground, because that way I don't need to erase unnecessarily. Working with similar looking colors also come with the disadvantage that sometimes it's hard to tell which part of the image is actually colored in the appropriate way. I kind of lost my train of thought. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that the conventions of a genre could exist on different levels. For some, it is on the narrative level, and for others, it's on the aesthetic level. Of course, the word aesthetic might not be exactly applicable to things such as writing, but I think to an extent it could be understood in different contexts, such as in writing. What I mean by that is the immediate appearance of something in a given media should be considered the aesthetic of that piece of work. For instance, the genre of texting is different from the way you would write a school paper. In the case of texting, what you would often do is use contractions and simple shorthands instead of typing out full words. However, you wouldn't do that for a school paper because you expect to receive a poor grade for that. Nevertheless, the ways by which the two aforementioned things differ is what I think on the aesthetic level, as in the immediate appearance of what you're doing. So you could essentially talk about the same thing or send the same message using both text and in the format of an academic paper. Of course, the subgenres of academic papers differs immensely in the context of post-secondary education, but that's not important right now. The other thing on which genres could inject conventions into a certain work is the way the narrative works in each. So taking the example of horror movie again, we expect certain narrative segues to happen. For example, teenagers being isolated in a remote place and confusing a certain person who is actually good to be a monster, only to find the monster later who would probably kill the person who is actually trying to help the teenagers, even if that person might hold some discontent towards them. In the case of anime, we often come to expect the protagonist to get stronger and stronger, or be motivated to protect his friends, and I deliberately used his because that seems to be the default gender of the anime protagonist. But then again, I don't follow very many anime shows, so I might be speaking from incomplete data. Of course, even in a given media, there are many subgenres, like I said. The way you write a physics paper is vastly different from the way you write an English paper. And personally, I have done both. I might have said something that I edited out. The narrative conventions of a genre, I think, are easier to disrupt or forsake with less consequence towards the reception and promotion of a given work. So for example, if you wanted to break the genre conventions of anime, it's probably easier if you tried to set up a protagonist who gets weaker over time, unlike what most anime would expect. Most anime audience would expect, I should say. However, it would probably be more difficult to do a genre break in the media in question by having your characters appear vastly different from what your viewers would expect. To use the words that I invented, it's easier to break given convention by the means of narrative than by the means of aesthetics. I would like to think that what I'm doing right now with my series is breaking the narrative conventions of my given media. Instead of having a strong-willed protagonist who conquers enemy after enemy to achieve victory, I'm going to portray a story in which the protagonist becomes more and more mentally deranged and weaker and weaker in a certain sense as the story advances. Before I do any other heavy spoiler, I think I should stop talking about my own work. Okay, one last thing before I stop the video. I'd like to talk a little bit about the works that influenced myself. Of course, this may not be of any interest to you, but for the purpose of documentation, I will be keeping this on record for myself. One of my earliest influence in drawing comics is actually Berserk. Ironically enough, I did not actually read the comic. However, I have seen fleeting views of that comic, and from how little I have seen of it, I still feel a distinct atmosphere and aesthetic that deeply impressed me. By watching some analysis videos, even though I didn't actually read the comic in question, I had a better sense of what the Berserk series is actually about. It portrays a very distinctly dark and monstrous world, and I find myself fascinated by it. That is how I came up with my first idea for a comic series. It's supposed to be a story about monsters in space. However, I have never actually started working on that series because I feel like I need to be a better artist and writer before I can start doing that. The other major influence on my work is Lovecraft. I am exposed to the works of Lovecraft mostly by audiobook form. If there is anything that I extrapolated from his work, it would be the idea that it's rather impressive, to me at least, to get the sense that what we know is only a small portion of what there is. The kind of smallness and insignificance inspired by the knowledge of a vast and indifferent universe, or perhaps a world entirely unknown. You can see more influence from Lovecraft on my other series, which is currently shelved because I didn't like the way I felt ham-handed when I was working on it. I feel like that work was not helping me grow as an artist, so I decided to put it on hold. There is a greater sense of mystery and unknown in that one, but given my mediocre skill, I wouldn't suggest you go looking at it right away. Besides that, I found the works of Ito, that is ITO, if I didn't pronounce that clearly enough, to be perhaps even a better example of Lovecraftian horror. Even though in the case of Ito, there is not necessarily as impressive of a world building aspect to the stories as there is in Lovecraft's. However, Ito's work is in the genre that I am working on, or should I say the media that I am working in. It might be a even better guide to how to construct the wanted effects in the media of comics. Besides that, I'm not sure where this began actually, but I also at some point picked up the idea that a world that is fictionally constructed should have a coherent system of physics, so to speak, that governs how things work. So I often find it unsatisfying that in many battle anime that the magic system is unexplained. So the characters would have differing abilities, however it wouldn't be explained in a coherent system where it's possible to predict what two different characters would do to each other. And when it becomes necessary to explain how two characters interact, it often becomes a particular explanation for a limited number of phenomena rather than something more like a science. This can be seen exemplified in Bleach, which coincidentally is also another series that inspired me more in the direction of style rather than anything else, even though my work is nowhere near the quality of Bleach in terms of drawing. So in Bleach, you would often have characters who have strange abilities that all seems very intriguing and unique on their own, but when it comes to interaction with one another, it can feel rather arbitrary sometimes to hear the characters monologue on and on about why a particular attack would have a particular effect. And without the author's guidance, you would hardly be able to come up with a prediction about the outcome of a battle between two characters who did not canonically fight each other in battle. So for most of my work, I have taken the time to construct a system almost like physics that explains how different mechanics and abilities are supposed to interact. For the current series at hand, though, there isn't such a system because it's supposed to all be video game, and I didn't intend the series to be long anyways. I intend to conclude it sooner rather than later. With that being said, I don't think there's anything else that I can talk about, and I think this is goodbye.